What if the nicest people in Hollywood weren't the ones giving speeches or posing for charity photos? What if real kindness happened quietly, on sound stages, in hospital rooms, and in moments no camera ever captured? During Hollywood's golden age, fame had the power to harden people, but a rare few resisted it. Today, we're looking beyond iconic roles and into lived behavior. These are the actors remembered not for applause, but for how they treated people when nothing was at stake. James Stewart. James Stewart's reputation for kindness was never built on dramatic gestures or carefully managed publicity. It was built on something far rarer in Hollywood: consistency. Day after day, film after film, Stewart treated everyone around him the same way, calmly, respectfully, and without hierarchy. On set, there was no sense that he believed his name on the marquee made him more important than the people holding lights, moving cables, or sweeping floors. To Stewart, filmmaking was not a pyramid. It was a shared effort. Everyone mattered, or no one did. Crew members repeatedly recalled that Stewart made a point of learning names. Not as a performative courtesy, not as a tactic to seem approachable. He learned them because he believed it was basic respect. If someone worked beside him every day, they deserved to be acknowledged as a person, not as a function. That habit stayed with him throughout his career, even as his fame grew and the sets grew larger. There was no forced charm in his behavior. Stewart wasn't chatty for the sake of image, nor was he distant or aloof. He was simply steady. If someone spoke to him, he listened. Yet if someone needed help, he responded. Many who worked with him later said his kindness was almost invisible in the moment, but unforgettable in hindsight. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand recognition. It just existed, reliably. Away from the cameras, that same instinct guided him. When a crew member fell seriously ill during a production, Stewart didn't delegate concern to an assistant or send flowers with a signed card. He went himself. He checked on the family. And without drawing attention to it, he quietly ensured that practical needs were covered during recovery. Bills were handled. Gaps were filled. No one was asked to acknowledge it publicly. There were no press releases, no stories planted. Stewart believed that help stopped being help the moment it became a performance. In his military service reflected that same character. During World War II, Stewart flew real combat missions, something very few stars of his stature actually did. He rose to the rank of brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve, carrying responsibility far beyond symbolism. Yet after the war, he avoided talking about it. When praised, he redirected attention elsewhere, visibly uncomfortable with being singled out. To Stewart, heroism wasn't something to be displayed or leveraged. It was something you did, and then moved on from. That humility carried into his public life. Fans experienced it firsthand. Stewart answered letters personally, long after fame made that unnecessary. At hospitals, airports, or studio gates, he took time, not in a rushed, obligated way, but with genuine presence. People didn't leave those encounters starstruck. Now they left feeling recognized. He made them feel like the interaction mattered as much to him as it did to them. In an industry built on illusion, image, and hierarchy, James Stewart stood apart without ever trying to. His kindness was not strategic. It was not cultivated. It was habitual, and that habit became his quiet legacy. Long after specific performances blur together, the stories that endure are simple ones: a name remembered, a visit made, a kindness offered without witness. James Stewart didn't reshape Hollywood by demanding change. He reshaped it by showing what decency looked like every day. Gregory Peck. Gregory Peck carried himself with a calm dignity that never hardened into distance. On Hollywood sets, he was known not for volume or authority, but for attentiveness. He treated drivers, assistants, technicians, and fellow actors with the same measured courtesy, never signaling that status determined worth. People didn't describe Peck as flashy or overly warm. They described him as present. He listened carefully. He didn't rush conversations. He didn't dismiss people because of hierarchy or schedule. His respect was quiet, but it was consistent. That steadiness shaped the atmosphere around him. Crew members often remarked that working with Peck felt unusually calm. There was no tension created by ego, no sense that anyone needed to perform deference. If a problem arose, he addressed it directly and without blame. If someone spoke, he gave them time. That habit, simple, unshowy attentiveness, became his signature. One of the clearest examples of Peck's character came during the production of Roman Holiday. After watching Audrey Hepburn's performance, Peck insisted she receive equal billing. At the time, This was nearly unheard of for an established male star, particularly one with Peck's box office stature. The studio resisted. Peck did not. Those close to the production later said the decision wasn't framed as generosity or mentorship. Peck saw it as accuracy. Hepburn's performance carried the film. Credit should reflect reality. There was no press strategy behind the move. No attempt to shape narrative. Peck simply refused to accept billing that implied a hierarchy he didn't believe existed. Hepburn would later say that this moment defined her early experience in Hollywood, not because of career impact alone, but because it revealed what fairness could look like in an industry that rarely practiced it. That same principle guided Peck's life off-screen. He volunteered quietly at veterans' hospitals, never bringing photographers or announcements. He didn't arrive to inspire from a distance. He arrived with time. He sat, he talked, he listened. In one documented case, a casual conversation about fishing with a recovering veteran led Peck to arrange a private trip months later, handled discreetly, without fanfare. The gesture wasn't symbolic. It was practical, and it was never meant to be known. Even when facing backlash later in his career, Peck's response remained consistent. After To Kill a Mockingbird, he received hate mail from viewers angered by the film's moral stance. Rather than ignoring the letters or responding defensively, Peck occasionally replied, calmly, respectfully. He explained his beliefs without insult or escalation. For him, kindness was not passivity. It was principle, applied even when it was uncomfortable. Those who worked with Gregory Peck didn't describe him as larger than life. They described him as grounded, someone acutely aware of the weight of influence and careful with how he used it. He didn't seek admiration. He sought alignment between what he believed and how he behaved. In a town that rewarded ego, Peck chose fairness, patience, and restraint. That choice defined him far more than fame ever could. Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda's kindness was never theatrical. It didn't announce itself, and it never sought validation. Instead, it revealed itself in moments where power could have been easily abused, and deliberately wasn't. On film sets, Fonda carried natural authority. His presence alone commanded respect. But what distinguished him was how carefully he used that authority. He understood that leadership was not about control, but responsibility. Crew members often recalled how attentive he was to the people around him. He noticed when someone was overworked, overlooked, or quietly struggling. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't issue demands for the sake of asserting dominance. But when something crossed the line into unfairness, he spoke up, calmly, directly, and without embarrassment. To Fonda, responsibility did not disappear simply because confrontation was uncomfortable. Silence, he believed, could be a form of complicity. That sense of responsibility became especially visible during 12 Angry Men, a project he also produced. The film's single-room setting created intense conditions. The heat was real. The hours were long. The physical strain affected both cast and crew. Budget pressures encouraged speed and efficiency, and there was constant incentive to push through discomfort. Fonda refused to let that become the norm. He insisted on reasonable working conditions. Breaks were protected. Concerns were addressed instead of dismissed. Comfort mattered. He believed exhaustion didn't produce better performances. Respect did. That philosophy quietly shaped the atmosphere on set. People worked hard, but they didn't feel disposable. The tone was demanding without being punishing, focused without being cruel. Younger actors remembered Fonda most for his patience. When nerves caused mistakes, he didn't correct them sharply or allow embarrassment to linger. Instead, he shared stories from his own early career, stories of fear, uncertainty, and missteps. He spoke openly about self-doubt at a time when admitting vulnerability was often seen as weakness. That honesty had a calming effect. It normalized anxiety in an industry that frequently punished it. Actors felt safer taking risks because they knew mistakes wouldn't be weaponized against them. One small story became legendary among crew members precisely because it was so understated. During a winter shoot, a security guard was seen shivering on set. Nothing was said publicly. No request was made. The next day, Fonda arrived carrying a warm coat. He handed it to the guard casually, as though it required no explanation, and walked away. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement. Many people didn't even realize what had happened until much later. To Fonda, kindness didn't require an audience. Throughout his long career, he never behaved as though success made him infallible. He asked questions, even when he could have assumed authority. He listened, even when time was short. He remained curious, open to perspectives that challenged his own. Fame did not calcify him. It didn't turn him inward or defensive. His behavior stayed remarkably consistent from early roles to late acclaim. Those who worked beside Henry Fonda often said the same thing. He made people feel respected without ever saying the word. He led without intimidation. He corrected without humiliation. He helped without expectation. In an industry that often rewarded ego, Fonda demonstrated a different model: authority without arrogance, kindness without performance, and leadership rooted in humility. That quiet consistency became his real legacy. Long after specific performances blur together, the stories that remain are simple ones: a break protected, a voice lowered instead of raised, a coat handed over without ceremony. Henry Fonda didn't just portray integrity on screen. He practiced it every day when it mattered most. Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly was demanding, but never demeaning. At a time when dancers were often treated as interchangeable parts in a machine built for speed and spectacle, Kelly pushed back against the idea that excellence required exhaustion, fear, or disregard. He believed discipline mattered, but dignity mattered more, and he made that belief non-negotiable. Kelly insisted on humane schedules, proper breaks, and basic respect for everyone involved in a production. These expectations frequently put him at odds with studios that prioritized efficiency and cost over people. So long rehearsals were common in musical filmmaking, but Kelly refused to let them become punitive. He argued that fatigue dulled precision and that resentment destroyed trust. To him, artistic greatness and exploitation were incompatible. You could not demand the best work from people while ignoring their limits. His leadership showed itself in details others overlooked. Kelly made a point of learning names, not just of lead performers, but of dancers, musicians, and crew members whose labor was rarely acknowledged. He noticed fatigue before it became failure. He noticed strain before it turned into injury. And when someone struggled financially, he helped quietly, without ceremony or publicity. One dancer later recalled receiving a new pair of shoes, anonymously during a difficult period, only realizing years later that Kelly had arranged it himself. The gesture was never meant to be traced back to him. It was meant to solve a problem, not create gratitude. That instinct extended beyond the stage. Cafeteria workers remembered Kelly greeting them every day, asking about families, and remembering details others forgot. He didn't treat them as background fixtures in a studio ecosystem. He treated them as collaborators. In an industry built on rigid hierarchy, that small consistency mattered. To Kelly, no one working on a film was invisible. Every role contributed to the final result, and every person deserved acknowledgement. Despite his enormous fame, Kelly remained grounded in everyday interactions. When neighborhood children approached him, he didn't wave them away or retreat behind celebrity distance. One such encounter turned into an impromptu dance lesson in a public space, a moment a young boy later described as life-changing. Kelly didn't see interruptions as inconveniences. He saw them as opportunities to connect, to share joy without performance or expectation. There was no audience to impress, only a moment to inhabit. Kelly's insistence on discipline never came at the expense of dignity. He worked relentlessly, but he worked fairly. He demanded commitment, but he returned it in equal measure. Dancers who trained under him often said they felt pushed, but also protected. They were challenged, but never disposable. Kelly understood that trust was essential to risk, and risk was essential to art. Without safety, movement became guarded. Without respect, precision collapsed. What made his leadership endure was consistency. He did not reserve kindness for special occasions or public moments. He applied it daily, in rehearsal rooms, cafeterias, hallways, and quiet conversations no one else witnessed. His behavior did not change with success. It didn't soften into sentimentality or harden into authority. It remained deliberate and structured, much like his choreography. On screen, Gene Kelly's legacy is defined by movement, joy, and precision. Off-screen, what people remembered most was intention. He moved through the world the same way he moved through dance, with awareness, control, and care for everyone involved. His kindness wasn't showy. It wasn't emotional theater. It was practical, disciplined, and sustained. And because of that, it lasted, long after the music stopped. Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire was known to audiences as the embodiment of elegance, control, and near-mythic precision. On screen, his movements looked effortless, almost inevitable. But those who worked with him remembered something just as striking, and far less discussed: his gentleness. Despite being widely regarded as the greatest film dancer of all time, Astaire never allowed perfectionism to harden into cruelty. His standards were exacting, but his manner was patient. Discipline for him was not a license to dominate. Dance partners consistently described him as encouraging rather than intimidating. Rehearsals with Astaire were rigorous, but never hostile. He guided rather than commanded. Even when sequences demanded relentless repetition, there was no edge in his voice, no suggestion that mistakes were personal failures. He believed precision came from trust, not fear. Where Astaire understood how vulnerable performers could feel, especially dancers asked to work alongside someone of his legendary skill. Instead of reinforcing hierarchy, he worked to dissolve it. When someone struggled, he didn't correct them publicly or sharply. He broke movements down into manageable parts. He demonstrated quietly. He repeated sequences without visible frustration. His goal was never to prove superiority. It was to make the work better, together. That instinct extended far beyond the dance floor. What surprised many collaborators was how deeply attentive Astaire was to everyone around him. He learned the names of musicians, stagehands, costume assistants, and technicians. And he remembered them. Weeks after brief introductions, he recalled details others forgot. He thanked people personally, not as a habit, but as a genuine acknowledgement of contribution. In an industry where recognition often flowed upward, Astaire made sure it flowed outward. He also used his influence carefully and generously. When collaborators faced disputes over credit or compensation, Astaire intervened quietly. He didn't argue loudly or posture publicly. He didn't turn advocacy into performance. Instead, he spoke privately to decision-makers, making sure others received the recognition or fairness they deserved, often without anyone knowing he had been involved. Many beneficiaries only learned of his role years later, if at all. Despite the reverence surrounding his name, Astaire consistently deflected praise. When younger performers expressed awe, he redirected the conversation back to them, asking about their work, their process, their ambitions. He listened closely. Fame never translated into entitlement. If anything, it made him more cautious, more deliberate about how his presence affected others. He understood the weight of reputation and treated it as a responsibility rather than a privilege. Astaire's kindness was not obvious in a single dramatic moment. It revealed itself slowly, through consistency, through the absence of fear in rehearsal rooms, through the number of people, decades later, who spoke about him in nearly identical terms. Patient, respectful, grateful. These descriptions didn't come from press releases or studio mythology. They came from lived experience. What made this gentleness remarkable was the contrast. Here was a man who defined cinematic perfection, who demanded endless rehearsal and microscopic precision, yet never forgot the humanity required to achieve it. He believed that artistry flourished best in environments where people felt safe, seen, and valued. That belief shaped not just his performances, but the people around him. Fred Astaire didn't lower standards to be kind. He proved that kindness and excellence were not opposites. And long after the choreography faded, that balance became part of his quiet legacy. James Cagney. James Cagney's explosive on-screen persona often led audiences to assume he carried the same intensity off camera. The reality was the opposite. In person, Cagney was modest, soft-spoken, and deeply considerate. Crew members frequently remarked on how calm he was, how little space he demanded, and how naturally he blended into the working environment, despite his immense fame. Cagney had a habit of bringing homemade lunches to set, simple, unpretentious meals that he often shared with crew members. There was no symbolism intended. It was just how he lived. He didn't separate himself from others by status or privilege, preferring familiarity over formality. He was especially kind to newcomers. When young extras or early career actors struggled with nerves, Cagney made time for them. He talked them through scenes, shared stories of his own early fears, and reassured them that uncertainty was part of the process. His goal wasn't flawless performance, it was comfort. Confidence, he believed, followed naturally. Quiet generosity marked much of his life. Cagney supported education privately, paying tuition for young people he met through the industry. These acts were largely unknown until years later, when recipients spoke about how brief encounters with him altered the course of their lives. During World War II, Cagney refused to exaggerate his role or importance. He viewed entertainers as supporters, not heroes, and never confused visibility with value. Fame, to him, was incidental, not defining. For those who worked beside him, Cagney's kindness never felt surprising. It felt organic. He didn't perform decency, he lived it. And in an industry fueled by ego and urgency, James Cagney stood out by remaining quietly, consistently human. Jack Lemmon. Jack Lemmon was widely known in Hollywood as someone who used success not as insulation, but as a bridge. While many stars became more guarded as their careers advanced, Lemmon moved in the opposite direction. The higher he rose, the more intentional he became about noticing people who were still finding their footing. He treated newcomers as equals, long before the industry decided they were worth paying attention to, and that instinct quietly shaped nearly every professional relationship he formed. Younger actors often recalled Lemmon offering encouragement without being asked. He never framed himself as a mentor, and never delivered lectures about craft or fame. Instead, he spoke carefully, choosing words that supported rather than overshadowed. His advice was practical, gentle, and rooted in empathy. When Lemmon believed in someone, he didn't just say so, he acted. He recommended names to directors, made introductions behind the scenes, and opened doors without announcing his involvement. Many beneficiaries didn't even realize he had helped until years later. His kindness extended just as naturally to crew members. Lemmon paid attention to the people who kept productions running smoothly, especially those whose ambitions extended beyond their current roles. During one film, a lighting technician mentioned taking night classes to advance his career. Lemmon didn't respond with empty praise. Instead, he quietly arranged for the technician to shadow senior crew members during downtime, creating a genuine opportunity for growth. It was a small intervention with lasting impact, the kind Lemmon preferred. Despite decades of acclaim, Lemmon remained visibly uncomfortable when praise focused exclusively on him. During award ceremonies, he often redirected attention toward collaborators, naming people audiences rarely heard of. He seemed acutely aware of how much labor went unseen in Hollywood, and was determined, whenever possible, to bring that work into the light. Those who worked with Lemmon rarely described him as commanding or impressive in the traditional sense. They described him as present, someone who noticed effort, someone who remembered faces, someone who never forgot how difficult it was to begin. In an industry obsessed with arrival, Jack Lemmon never stopped caring about the climb, and that, more than fame, defined his legacy. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy was not known for warmth in the conventional sense. He was private, reserved, and rarely demonstrative, even at the height of his fame. There were no grand gestures, no carefully crafted charm meant to soften a room. Yet among crew members and fellow actors, Tracy earned a reputation as one of the most respectful men they ever worked with. He didn't rely on charisma, humor, or generosity to define his presence. He relied on consistency, and over time, that consistency became a source of deep trust. On set, Tracy never dominated a room unnecessarily. He didn't raise his voice to assert authority, and he never treated people as expendable simply because production schedules were tight. His authority came from restraint. When conditions became unreasonable, long hours, unsafe setups, or crew exhaustion, Tracy spoke up quietly but firmly. He didn't dramatize the issue or posture for attention. He believed professionalism extended beyond performance. It included responsibility toward the people doing the work, especially those without power to protect themselves. Younger actors remembered his patience more than anything else. When someone struggled with a scene, Tracy didn't embarrass them or rush the process. He didn't sigh, interrupt, or signal frustration. He waited. He adjusted his timing. He allowed silence if silence was needed. That restraint created a sense of safety, particularly for performers early in their careers who feared being judged, replaced, or labeled difficult. Tracy understood something many stars didn't. Confidence grew best in calm conditions, not pressure. Behind the scenes, he avoided privilege whenever possible. Tracy ate where the crew ate. He stood where others stood. He waited when others waited. There was no sense that he believed himself above the process or entitled to special treatment because of his reputation. Respect, in his view, wasn't something you demanded or announced. It was something you demonstrated repeatedly through behavior. What ultimately set Spencer Tracy apart wasn't warmth or approachability in the traditional sense. It was reliability. People knew exactly what to expect from him. And what they could expect was fairness, day after day, set after set. In an industry built on unpredictability, ego, and sudden shifts in power, that steadiness mattered deeply. Tracy may not have been outwardly warm, but his consistency created an environment where people felt secure. And in Hollywood, where instability was often the norm, that quiet sense of safety became a rare and lasting gift. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper's kindness was so understated that it was easy to miss, unless you were the one on the receiving end of it. Unnaturally shy and deeply uncomfortable with attention, Cooper never fit the stereotype of a Hollywood star who commanded a room. Instead, He moved through sets and public spaces with restraint, speaking softly and rarely asserting himself unless it truly mattered. Yet that very restraint became his defining quality. Extras and crew members often remembered Cooper for moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but stayed with them for years. He made eye contact. He nodded. He smiled. In an industry where hierarchy was rigid and invisible, labor often ignored, Cooper never treated people as scenery. He acknowledged presence, and that acknowledgement carried weight. Cooper disliked confrontation, but he valued fairness. When he witnessed mistreatment, whether it involved rushed schedules, dismissive behavior, or unnecessary harshness, he addressed it privately and calmly. There were no speeches or grandstands. He believed correction worked best when it preserved dignity on all sides. People listened to him because he rarely spoke without reason. Fans experienced the same quiet decency. Cooper didn't perform warmth, but he didn't rush encounters either. He listened more than he talked. Even brief interactions felt sincere, because he wasn't trying to manage impressions. Many fans later said that meeting him didn't feel like meeting a legend. It felt like meeting someone thoughtful who happened to be famous. Cooper also avoided Hollywood excess whenever possible. He preferred simplicity, routine, and distance from spectacle. Fame to him was not an achievement, but a condition, temporary and unpredictable. That perspective shaped his behavior. Nay, he never acted entitled to admiration or deference. For those who worked beside him, Gary Cooper's kindness wasn't loud or memorable in a single story. It was cumulative. It built slowly through consistency. And in an industry defined by ego and urgency, his quiet decency became a form of integrity that people trusted. Burt Lancaster. Burt Lancaster was physically imposing, charismatic, and commanding on screen. But off camera, what stayed with people was not intimidation. It was protection. Lancaster believed deeply in responsibility, especially toward those with less power. On set, he carried authority naturally, but he never used it to dominate. When tension arose during long or demanding productions, he didn't escalate it. He resolved it, calmly, directly, and effectively. Crew members consistently recalled Lancaster stepping in when someone was being treated unfairly. His tolerance for bullying was minimal, regardless of whether it came from a director, producer, or fellow star. Rank didn't matter to him. If someone crossed a line, Lancaster addressed it. Not theatrically, not angrily, just decisively. His loyalty extended to anyone doing the work. He was particularly attentive to colleagues facing personal difficulties. Lancaster noticed changes in behavior, mood, or energy. He asked questions without prying, creating space rather than pressure. And when help was needed, he offered it without ceremony. No announcements, no expectation of gratitude. Action mattered more to him than acknowledgement. Despite his fame, Lancaster never demanded admiration. Respect followed him because he earned it, by showing up prepared, speaking plainly, and backing words with action. He didn't confuse strength with dominance. To him, real strength meant stability. It meant being someone others could rely on when things went wrong. Lancaster also believed in accountability. If he made a mistake, he owned it. If he gave his word, he kept it. That reliability shaped his reputation more than his physical presence ever could. People trusted him, not because he was powerful, but because he was consistent. His kindness wasn't gentle or sentimental. It was practical, dependable. And for many who worked beside him, knowing that Burt Lancaster would step in when it mattered made difficult sets survivable. In Hollywood, that kind of strength was rare and unforgettable. William Holden's screen presence often carried an edge, conflict, tension, and emotional weight that suggested intensity beneath the surface. Yet those who worked closely with him were frequently struck by how gentle he was away from the camera. Off-set, Holden was patient, approachable, and quietly thoughtful. Fame never made him distant or superior. If anything, it heightened his awareness of how easily people could be overlooked in an industry built on hierarchy, and how important it was not to let that happen. Crew members rarely remembered Holden for dramatic gestures. What stayed with them were conversations. He spoke with people rather than at them, asking questions and genuinely listening to the answers. In Hollywood, where time often equaled status, Holden never rushed interactions simply because he could. But he understood that taking a few extra minutes, especially with crew members whose work was rarely acknowledged, could change the tone of an entire day. That willingness to slow down brought calm to sets that were otherwise tense by design. Fans experienced the same sincerity. Holden didn't hide behind handlers when he could avoid it. Even when tired or distracted, he acknowledged people directly. He understood that a brief encounter might carry lasting significance for someone else. Many fans later recalled that what stayed with them wasn't excitement or starstruck awe, but the unexpected feeling of being recognized as an individual rather than part of a crowd. Holden avoided entitlement. He never treated admiration as something he was owed. Instead, he viewed fame as temporary, something that could disappear as easily as it arrived. That perspective grounded him. He was careful not to confuse visibility with importance or applause with personal worth. This awareness shaped his professional relationships as well. Holden didn't dominate rooms or conversations. He collaborated. He listened. He respected the process and the people who made it work. When disagreements arose, he handled them quietly, without humiliation or escalation. For those who worked beside him, William Holden felt human in an industry that often wasn't. His kindness lived in attentiveness, patience, and restraint, qualities that made long productions easier and collaboration genuinely possible. Paul Newman. Paul Newman arrived in Hollywood near the end of the Golden Age, but he embodied many of its most enduring values. From early in his career, the Newman believed that success was not a reward. It was a responsibility. Fame, in his view, didn't elevate a person, it tested them, and he approached that test with unusual seriousness. Crew members consistently remembered Newman for fairness. He treated everyone the same regardless of rank, recognition, or proximity to power. There was no shift in his behavior depending on who was watching. He didn't perform kindness for effect. He practiced it quietly, day after day. Fans noticed the same sincerity. Newman never acted as though public attention was something he deserved simply by existing in the spotlight. He believed generosity should be invisible. When Newman helped someone, he didn't announce it. When he listened, he was fully present. And when praised, he redirected attention elsewhere, toward collaborators, causes, awe, or the work itself. Being placed above others made him visibly uncomfortable. Equality mattered more to him than admiration. One of Newman's defining traits was perspective. He understood how easily success could distort priorities and ego, and he worked deliberately to prevent that distortion. He remained aware of the temporary nature of fame and behaved accordingly, never confusing celebrity with character or applause with meaning. Newman once remarked that fame didn't change who he was. It simply gave him more chances to help. And he used those chances thoughtfully, often invisibly. His legacy extends far beyond the performances preserved on screen. It lives in the consistency of his character, the restraint of his ego, and the responsibility he carried long after the spotlight moved on. Hollywood's golden age is remembered for glamour, but its truest legacy lies elsewhere. When the camera stopped, a few stars chose decency over ego. Their kindness lived in small, quiet moments, remembered names, unspoken help, genuine respect. Long after applause faded, those human moments endured, shaping legacies no spotlight could ever capture.